The first time you heard the term callous unemotional traits, it probably sounded like a cold, clinical label for a child you'd already met. Maybe in a classroom, maybe in a headline, maybe in a memory you don't fully trust anymore. The label itself is neutral, a cluster of behaviors, reduced empathy, shallow affect, lack of guilt or remorse. But the moment a psychologist assigns it to a child under the age of 10, something shifts. That file doesn't just sit on a desk. It travels. It follows the child through every subsequent evaluation, every school meeting, every referral. And the forces that gather around that single diagnostic label, clinical, legal, institutional, are powerful enough to silence the very professionals who first spoke it. This is not a story about a bad kid. This is a story about what happens when the system that's supposed to help cannot agree on whether the wiring is even there. You're about to walk into a contradiction that the mental health field has been circling for decades, but rarely discusses in public. On one side, you have decades of neurological research, fMRI scans, longitudinal studies, twin cohort data, showing that callous unemotional traits, or CU traits, are among the most heritable psychological dimensions ever measured. On the other side, you have a clinical environment that punishes early identification. The very professionals trained to spot the pattern, child psychologists, school counselors, forensic evaluators, are systematically discouraged from documenting it in children younger than adolescents. If you've ever read a headline about a school shooting or a violent juvenile case and felt like the warning signs were obvious in hindsight, you already know the uneasy gap between what was seen and what was said. The gap isn't ignorance, it's structural silence. That silence is not a clinical oversight. It is an institutional architecture built to avoid liability. If you want to keep auditing how that architecture gets constructed case by case, subscribe to continue documenting the unspoken patterns of forensic neurology. And in the comments, write the single word you believe best describes what the system is most afraid to say about a child before age 12. Maybe it is callous, maybe liability, maybe stigma. Pick one. The evidence for the neurological basis of CU traits is not fringe. By the early 2000s, research teams at the University of Wisconsin and the Institute of Psychiatry in London had already mapped the core circuitry. The amygdala, the anterior insula, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Each region processes emotional salience, fear recognition, and moral reasoning. In children with elevated CU traits, these regions show reduced functional connectivity and blunted reactivity to distress cues. One study scanned children as young as 9 and found that those with high CU scores showed a 30% reduction in amygdala activation when viewing images of fearful faces. Not a behavioral score, a biological signature. But here is where the clinical reality collides with the neuroscience. That signature is detectable. It is not deterministic. High CU traits in childhood do not guarantee adult violence, and the developmental path forks repeatedly, influenced by parenting quality, peer environment, trauma exposure, and early intervention. Yet the sheer weight of the heritability data. Some twin studies estimate CU traits are between 50 and 70% heritable, makes the pattern feel wired. And that is precisely why psychologists hesitate. If you label a child as callous unemotional before the age of 12, you risk triggering a cascade of outcomes that are not clinical, but social and institutional. Think about what happens once the label enters the official record. The school interprets defiance differently. The court views rehabilitation skeptically. The parents face a new kind of stigma. Not your child is struggling, but your child is wired wrong. The very trait profile that makes early intervention most urgent also makes it least likely to be funded, supported, or even attempted. The logic becomes circular. We don't treat what we can't talk about, and we can't talk about what we haven't labeled. There is a specific historical anchor here that most discussions skip. In 1999, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry published practice parameters for the assessment of conduct disorder. Those parameters included a specifier for limited prosocial emotions, the clinical precursor to what we now call CU traits. But it wasn't until the DSM-5 in 2013 that the specifier officially entered the diagnostic manual. That is a 14-year gap between clinical awareness and official recognition. 14 years during which thousands of children were assessed, treated, or merely observed while the diagnostic vocabulary remained technically optional. That 14-year gap is not an anomaly. It is the standard delay that emerges when the incentives align against early naming. If you want to track every subsequent delay, if educational, legal, pharmaceutical, subscribe to keep following the forensic trail of diagnostic inertia. And in the comments, share the number of years you estimate it will take before early screening for CU traits becomes mandatory in your own country's school system. The answer reveals more about your region than about the neuroscience. The real cost of that silence appears in the data that never gets collected. If the label is avoided, the prevalence rate gets artificially depressed. If the prevalence rate is depressed, research funding flows elsewhere. If funding flows elsewhere, no large-scale early intervention trials are designed. And without those trials, the only evidence available comes from forensic populations. Adolescents already in the justice system, which makes CU traits look rare, extreme, and untreatable. The bias is baked into the sampling method. Let's be precise about the numbers that do exist. Depending on the study and the measurement tool, between 2 and 6% of school-age children meet the threshold for clinically elevated CU traits. That is roughly one child in every typical classroom of 25. These are not children who are visibly violent day one. They are children who show a pattern of reduced empathy, shallow emotional depth, and a notably low response to punishment or reward-based discipline. The teachers notice, the parents notice, the pediatrician sometimes notices. But when the psychologist is asked to write an evaluation for school services or court proceedings, the word callous rarely appears. The mechanism that enforces this silence is not a formal policy. It is a diffuse institutional pressure. School districts, fearing litigation if they stigmatize a student, discourage specific diagnostic language in IEP documentation. Child welfare agencies, underfunded and overextended, prefer language that emphasizes environmental trauma over biological predisposition. Insurance reimbursement codes favor diagnoses that suggest treatability. CU traits in the current clinical climate carry a subtext of low treatability, which means they can trigger reimbursement denials for intensive therapy. And yet the neuroscience keeps accumulating. In 2017, a team at the University of Pennsylvania published a meta-analysis of 27 neuroimaging studies of children and adolescents with conduct disorder. The finding, reduced gray matter volume in the amygdala and insula, was consistently associated with the CU dimension, not the aggression dimension. In other words, the neurological markers were specific to emotional detachment, not to violence itself. This matters because it separates two conflated ideas. A child who fights is not the same as a child who doesn't feel. The system tends to treat them identically. The scan disagrees. Now consider what happens when a clinician decides to document the pattern anyway. The clinician often faces a choice between diagnostic honesty and practical advocacy. If the CU specifier is added to a conduct disorder diagnosis, the child may become ineligible for certain school-based interventions that are designed for externalizing disorders without the CU dimension. The very label that accurately describes the wiring closes the door to the only services available. So the psychologist makes a calculation. Omit the specifier, keep the services, lose the research data. The individual child benefits in the short term. The population knowledge base stays shallow. This is the core tension that rarely surfaces in public discourse. The system is not designed to handle a trait profile that is highly heritable, neurologically grounded, and yet responsive to early intervention only when the intervention is intensive, sustained, and delivered before adolescence. The system is designed for conditions that respond to standard outpatient therapy or medication. CU traits do not. They require contingency management protocols, emotional coaching paradigms, parent management training with very specific reinforcement timing, and in some cases, pharmacological targeting of the amygdala prefrontal circuitry itself using drugs that are not approved for pediatric use. And still, the silence persists, not because the evidence is missing, because the incentives are misaligned. The researcher wants to publish, the clinician wants to help the kid in the room today. The school wants to avoid controversy, the court wants to assign blame. Each actor has a rational self-interest in not being the one to name the pattern aloud, and so the child passes through the system with a collection of vague labels: oppositional, defiant, disruptive, mood disordered, none of which capture the specific neurological signature that the scans are picking up. By the time that child reaches adolescence and appears in a courtroom, the question becomes retroactive. How did nobody see this coming? The answer is uncomfortable. People saw it, they just didn't say it. If you search the academic literature for cases where the pattern was documented early and the intervention was attempted, you find a small set of pilot programs. One in particular ran out of a university clinic in the Pacific Northwest between 2005 and 2008. 16 children, aged 7 to 10, all meeting the criteria for conduct disorder with the CU specifier, received a year-long protocol combining parent-child interaction therapy with a component called emotional engagement training. The results were modest. About half showed measurable improvement in empathy recognition and effective response. The other half did not. But here is the detail that got buried in the follow-up. The children who improved were the ones whose parents completed the full training. The children who did not improve were the ones whose parents dropped out. The neurological wiring could be partially overridden, but only if the environment was restructured deliberately enough. That finding is both hopeful and profoundly limited. It suggests the circuitry is not immutable in childhood. The plasticity window remains partially open, but the intervention burden falls on the caregiver, not the child. And the caregivers who complete a year-long intensive protocol with a child who shows no gratitude, no warmth, and no emotional reciprocity are rare. They are outliers. The system has no mechanism to support them. The pilot ended when the grant expired. This is where the silence loops back on itself, because the data from that pilot, like the data from the neuroimaging studies, exists. It is published. It is peer-reviewed. It sits in journals that any clinician with a university login can access, but the institutional infrastructure to translate that data into routine screening protocols, into funded intervention tracks, into school-based identification systems that do not trigger litigation. That infrastructure does not exist. The knowledge is present. The machinery to apply it is absent. You are now standing in the gap between what the science shows and what the system allows. The scans detect the pattern by age 9. The twin data confirms the heritability. The intervention pilots show partial efficacy, and yet, in most school districts and most child mental health clinics, the diagnostic vocabulary will not be used. The child will be called difficult. The teacher will be told to try harder. The parent will be offered standard parenting classes that assume a child with intact emotional circuitry. And the data point will be lost. 20 years from now, when the next longitudinal study is published, it will likely confirm what the current data already suggests, that early identification combined with intensive contingency-based intervention is the only path to reducing the proportion of high CU children who go on to commit violent acts in adolescence. The study will be discussed at conferences. It will be cited in policy briefs. And the same structural silence will prevent it from being implemented because the incentives have not changed. The circuits are visible, the scans are clear, the children are sitting in classrooms, and the professionals are choosing silence. The gap is not neurological. It is a gap in courage, in funding, in the willingness to say out loud that some wiring is different, and that difference demands a different response. You already know what the system will do instead. It will wait until the wiring shows up in a courtroom, and then it will act surprised. That courtroom surprise is predictable because the machinery of intervention was never built. The question now is whether you will remain inside the gap or become part of the force that closes it. Subscribe to keep auditing the institutional mechanics that allow the silence to persist every case, every study, every failure of translation. And in the comments, name the single intervention you believe holds the most untapped potential for rewiring the system itself. Emotional engagement training, contingency management, parent-child therapy, or something else entirely. Pick one and explain why the data already supports it.